The roar of 20,000 filled the Las Vegas Hilton. Glasses clinked, voices collided, the air heavy with perfume, sweat, and the haze of cigarettes. The year was 1972, Elvis Presley's Vegas era. The curtain trembled. Then he stepped out. White jumpsuit glittering under the spotlights, cape flowing, hair slicked with the sheen of stage heat. The crowd erupted, some screaming with adoration, others drunk on whiskey and anticipation. But beneath the deafening cheers, another sound cut through. A harsh voice from deep in the hall. A man, unsteady on his feet, shouted words no one expected to hear. At first people laughed, but then the shouting grew louder, angrier, spilling venom into the music. One by one, heads turned. The cheering faltered. The storm of excitement collapsed into a hush so sharp you could hear ice sliding in a glass. Security tensed, ready to pounce. All eyes flicked between the stage and the shadows in the crowd. Would Elvis stop? Would the man be dragged out? Or would something else happen? Something no one in this glittering city of noise could predict. And then, with the calm of a man who had faced storms before, Elvis lifted his hand. The decision froze everyone in place. This was supposed to be just another Vegas night, the narrator whispers. But none of the 20,000 inside knew they were about to witness a moment that would be remembered for decades. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The night in Las Vegas carried its own kind of electricity. By the early 1970s, the Strip was a canyon of neon fire, humming endlessly with dice tumbling, glasses clinking, and promises of fortune whispered under chandeliers heavy with smoke. The casinos pulsed with a feverish rhythm, but there was only one true center of gravity that summer evening, the showroom of the International Hotel. Inside, 20,000 people were packed together, an ocean of expectation. The place smelled of perfume layered over sweat, of liquor mingling with cigarette ash. Ice shifted in tumblers as waiters hurried between tables, and the velvet of the seats felt almost damp beneath the palms of anxious fans. Men in tailored suits leaned back with the confidence of money. Women in glittering gowns whispered into jeweled compacts, adjusting lipstick before the curtain rose. Soldiers on leave in their pressed uniforms laughed too loudly at nothing at all, trying to shake off the heaviness of memories. Tourists from the Midwest, cheeks still pink from desert sun, clutched programs like sacred relics. It was a melting pot of America compressed into one hall, every pair of eyes waiting for the same man. Backstage, Elvis Presley stood tall in his white jumpsuit, embroidered with gold and crimson, a cape resting on his shoulders like something torn from mythology. The years of drifting through Hollywood productions had nearly hollowed him out, but the Vegas stage gave him his pulse back. After his comeback special in '68, after the sleepless months of rehearsal, he had returned to himself, leaner, sharper, a king in full command of his kingdom. Yet the crown weighed heavily. Every night he felt both adored and dissected. Every glance from the audience could be love or judgment. The orchestra struck its opening notes, a thunder that made glasses tremble on the tables. The stage lights bathed the curtain in gold. The room erupted, 20,000 throats pouring out screams that melted into one long roar. For a moment, the sound was so enormous it seemed to lift the ceiling, and then Elvis stepped forward into it, like a general marching into battle. He sang with the force of a man who had fought to reclaim his soul. Each note cut through the smoke and chatter, slicing through the doubts that trailed him since Hollywood and the army. His voice wrapped around the audience. Husbands forgot their cynicism, wives forgot themselves. Even the rich men who had come to smirk found themselves leaning forward. The music washed over them, binding strangers into a single heartbeat. But beneath that tide of adoration, Vegas was Vegas. There were always undercurrents, pockets of drunken laughter that didn't match the rhythm. Figures slouched too far in their seats. Here, the bourbon flowed freely, and with it, tempers and wounds no suit or gown could cover. Halfway through the set, somewhere in the middle rows, a man had been growing louder. At first it was muttered words, half drowned by the orchestra. A neighbor hushed him. Another patted his shoulder with the clumsy goodwill of the buzzed. But the mutters sharpened. The man's voice rose in jagged bursts, slurred insults, words spat like stones. A woman beside him winced and inched away. A businessman glared, snapping for an usher, but the ushers hesitated. In a hall this vast, you didn't remove someone unless you had to. The man wasn't just drunk. There was something in his tone that cut deeper than the careless heckles of a gambler. His anger carried history, grief pressed into syllables. His eyes, bloodshot and restless, darted toward the stage as though he were staring not at a singer, but at a mirror of everything he had lost. Around him, whispers stirred. People leaned away, protective of their night, their fantasy. Some giggled nervously, hoping it wouldn't spread. But others stiffened, sensing the danger of a storm gathering inside one man's chest. On stage, Elvis's voice soared, but he could feel the shift. He had been performing too long not to. He knew when a crowd adored him, when they doubted him, when they were distracted. The current tonight carried a new thread, the jagged edge of confrontation. He glanced toward the darkened rows, where the shouts began to pierce through the orchestra's wall of sound. At first, he tried to drown it, his voice pushing harder, the band swelling around him. But then came a cry that was impossible to ignore, a raw shout that sliced through brass and strings alike. Heads turned, glasses stopped mid-air. The moment quivered, fragile as spun glass. The storm had broken, and somewhere deep inside, Elvis felt it too. The stage lights burned hotter, the cape clung heavier, and though the hall still roared for him, he sensed the battle line being drawn. The orchestra swelled into the next number, horns blazing, the rhythm section pounding like a second heartbeat. Elvis leaned into the microphone, his voice soaring above the brass, every syllable laced with both velvet and steel. The crowd leaned forward, caught in his gravity. For a moment, it seemed as though the tension from that single unruly voice had been swallowed by the sheer force of music. Then it cut through again, sharper, louder, impossible to mistake. "Fraud!" The word tore across the room like a glass shattering on marble. Heads jerked toward the middle rows. A few laughed nervously, thinking it part of the chaos of Vegas nightlife. But the laughter died quickly as the voice surged again, this time with more venom, pushing through the swell of strings. "You're nothing but a clown in rhinestones." The insult rang so clear, it seemed the microphone itself had caught it. The orchestra faltered for half a bar, and Elvis, mid-line, stopped. The word hung in the air like smoke no one could wave away. A hush rippled outward. In a hall of 20,000, silence spread like a contagion. Only the clinking of a glass in the far corner remained, until even that stilled. The show had screeched to a halt. Elvis straightened, his hand gripping the microphone stand, his eyes locked on the darkened section where the shouts had come from. He squinted slightly against the stage lights. He wasn't angry? Not yet. His expression carried more surprise than fury, as though he had been momentarily pulled out of a dream. The audience began to stir. A chorus of disapproval rose from every side, boos, whistles, shouts of "Sit down!" and "Throw him out." Others laughed uneasily, hoping Elvis would deliver a witty comeback to restore the balance. But underneath it all, there was tension, a crack in the facade of glamour. People shifted in their seats, torn between outrage at the disruption and fascination with what might happen next. At the edge of the stage, security men appeared. They had seen this before. Drunken gamblers stumbling too far, hecklers trying to prove themselves. The guards' hands twitched, ready to surge forward and drag the offender away before the spell of the evening shattered completely. Their bodies leaned forward, waiting for the signal. Elvis raised a hand. The gesture was calm but commanding, slicing the air like a blade. The guards froze. Murmurs swept through the audience. He wasn't going to have the man removed. Instead, he tilted the microphone ever so slightly and said, clearly enough for all to hear, "Leave him." The decision stunned the room. 20,000 people hung suspended in uncertainty. The heckler, emboldened by the reprieve, shouted again, "You hear me, Presley? You're a circus act, a puppet in a jumpsuit." Gasps erupted. For an instant, it felt as though the very stage lights dimmed. This was more than an insult. It was a direct strike at everything Elvis carried. The costumes, the spectacle, the years of trying to reconcile the boy from Memphis with the icon the world demanded. The weight of 20,000 eyes bore down on him. It wasn't just curiosity. They wanted to know if the king would falter. Could a single voice break through the armor of legend? Would he lash out? Would he crumble? Elvis stood utterly still. He didn't blink, didn't shift. He looked straight toward the shadowed figure and simply breathed, the microphone catching the faint sound. The stillness was louder than any chord the band could play. Somewhere in the audience, a woman whispered, "Don't let him get to you." Another voice shouted, "We love you, Elvis." The hall teetered between loyalty and chaos. Inside, Elvis felt the old tug of contradiction. The Memphis boy who still wanted to belong. The global star constantly accused of selling out. The soldier who had done his duty. The son who still heard his mother's voice telling him to be kind. 1,000 lives seemed to converge in this single heartbeat. The insult lingered in the air like smoke after gunfire. And Elvis knew. The next words he spoke would decide not just the night, but something larger. In Vegas, reputations were made or ruined in seconds. One false move and the story would spread across newspapers, whispered through casinos, cemented in gossip before dawn. The silence deepened, suffocating, until it felt as though even the neon outside had dimmed. Elvis leaned slightly forward, his eyes unwavering. The hall held its breath. He had chosen not to let the guards silence the man. He had chosen to face it himself. The challenge had been thrown, and the king was about to answer. For a long second, Elvis stood motionless at the edge of the spotlight. The glitter of his suit caught the beams overhead, but his face was shadowed, unreadable. The audience was still frozen, waiting for him to snap, to laugh, to lash out, anything to break the unbearable silence. Then, with a suddenness that drew a ripple of gasps, he stepped forward. His boots thudded softly against the stage, each movement deliberate. The microphone cord uncoiled behind him like a trail. The hall was so still that the sound of his footfall seemed magnified, like the crack of distant thunder. He stopped only a few feet from the lip of the stage, leaning slightly toward the rows where the heckler sat. His lips curved, not in anger, but in amusement. The faintest smile broke across his face. Unexpected, disarming. "Kind of funny you say clown," Elvis said into the mic, his voice smooth but edged with irony. "I always wanted a circus of my own." A wave of laughter erupted. It rolled across the showroom like a tide, spilling out in cheers and applause. People slapped tables, some even stood to clap, grateful for the relief from tension. The band members, still frozen with instruments in hand, allowed themselves faint smiles. For an instant, it seemed Elvis had seized control again with nothing but a joke. But the man wasn't finished. His voice cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. "You're no hero, Presley. You dance for them, for the rich. You've forgotten us!" This time the crowd's amusement curdled into unease. The stranger's fury wasn't random drunken heckling. It had teeth. His words struck at the very heart of what Elvis represented. The audience began to hiss and boo, some craning their necks to get a better look. Elvis didn't retreat. He tilted his head, that half-smile still playing on his lips, though his eyes sharpened. Then, astonishingly, he took another step forward. So close now he could see the man's outline in the dim light beyond the stage. The heckler rose from his seat. His body wavered unsteadily, but his determination was clear. He pushed past the woman beside him, ignoring her protest, and began forcing his way toward the stage. The audience reacted instantly. Shrieks, murmurs, scattered panic. People scooted back in their seats, some shielding themselves as though expecting violence. Chairs scraped against the floor. The tension spiraled upward with every step the man took. Security surged forward again, their shoulders tense, ready to intercept. Two men in dark suits reached the edge of the aisle, prepared to drag him out bodily. The stranger stumbled, but caught himself, his gaze locked on the stage like a man charging a fortress. And again, Elvis raised his hand. "No!" His voice cut through the chaos, firm, steady, impossible to ignore. The guards halted, disbelief etched across their faces. The crowd gasped. Twice now, he had stopped them. The decision electrified the air. He wasn't simply tolerating this intruder. He was inviting him closer. The man continued forward, staggering down the aisle, drawing nearer to the footlights. Every head turned, following him. A ripple of fear passed through the hall. What if he had a weapon? What if he intended harm? In an era when stage rushes had already occurred, the possibility wasn't far-fetched. But Elvis didn't flinch. His posture remained calm, almost regal. He held the microphone loosely, letting it dangle at his side, as though trusting his voice alone would be enough to hold the storm. The orchestra had gone utterly silent. The only sound now was the stranger's ragged breathing as he neared the stage, and the scattered cries of protest from audience members telling him to stop. People were on edge, hearts pounding, waiting for the inevitable collision. For those in the hall, the image burned into memory. Elvis, standing illuminated in white and gold, cape falling in folds around him, unshaken, facing down a lone figure pushing through the darkness. It felt less like a concert and more like a duel, two lives crossing in a single moment, 20,000 witnesses holding their breath. The heckler stumbled against the front row, gripping a chair to steady himself. His face was flushed, his hair slicked to his forehead with sweat. He raised his hand as though reaching for the stage itself. And Elvis, unbelievably, leaned down toward him. His eyes never left the man's, the faint smile gone now, replaced by something else. A calm intensity, as if he were seeing not a drunk, but a reflection of some deeper wound. "Let him through," Elvis said again, quieter this time, but firm enough that it carried through the microphone. The words shocked even those closest to him. Some screamed, "No!" Others shouted for security to act. But Elvis stood unshaken, the stage light bathing him in a glow that made him seem larger than life, immovable. And so the guards hesitated. The man clambered forward, his fingers clutching at the edge of the stage, pulling himself upward with desperate force. The crowd recoiled in terror, certain that chaos was about to erupt. But Elvis didn't step back. He waited. The confrontation was no longer a disturbance. It had become a spectacle greater than the concert itself. And with every heartbeat, the tension drew tighter, until the entire hall seemed ready to snap. The hall that had moments before thundered with applause now felt like a cathedral emptied of sound. The sudden absence of music pressed down heavier than any note the orchestra could strike. Even the gamblers at the farthest tables, usually restless and distracted, were frozen. All eyes were on the intruder. He was close now, pulling himself against the lip of the stage with unsteady hands. His breathing rasped audibly in the hush, every exhale like sandpaper dragged through the quiet. Around him, the audience shrank back. Men in tuxedos leaned away protectively. Women clutched their purses, shifting their chairs with nervous jerks. It was as though he carried with him a contagion everyone feared. The lights bathed him mercilessly, showing the ruin of drink and sleepless nights. His jacket hung loose, wrinkled, the tie long since abandoned. His eyes burned red from more than whiskey. There was grief in them, sharp and unfiltered, the kind that no performance could mask. He wasn't here merely to disrupt. He had come bearing a wound. "Sell out!" he roared, his voice cracking but strong enough to strike the rafters. "You forgot where you came from!" Gasps rippled through the hall. Some tried to hush him with shouts of, "Sit down!" but they rang hollow. The rawness of his words landed like blows, louder than any heckle. "You ain't that boy from Memphis anymore," he spat. "You're a show pony for men with money." The sting of the accusation hung suspended. In Las Vegas, of all places, where fortunes glittered in chandeliers and vanished in dice rolls, the words carried an ugly ring of truth. The crowd stiffened, glancing from the man to Elvis, as though watching a verdict being pronounced. Elvis didn't move. He stood tall, his cape glimmering under the spotlights, his jaw set, but his eyes locked on the man. He said nothing. The silence stretched unbearably, until it became louder than the shouts themselves. The audience, sensing something unordinary, also fell quiet. 20,000 people held their breath, waiting for the king to strike back or to wave security forward. But Elvis neither commanded nor retreated. He simply watched, and the pause grew so deep that it felt eternal. Then, slowly, deliberately, Elvis removed the guitar strapped across his chest. The instrument had been his shield, his companion through decades of songs. He unbuckled the strap with steady fingers, set the guitar against the microphone stand, and stepped toward the very edge of the stage. The gesture shocked the audience more than any outburst would have. It was an invitation. He lowered his microphone, his voice even, measured. "You want to tell me something to my face?" He pointed to the man with a quiet authority that brooked no refusal. "Come closer. Say it here." The words rolled across the showroom like thunder in a valley. For an instant, panic flared. Some spectators shouted, "Throw him out!" Others stood half from their seats, prepared to flee. The security men stiffened, their instincts screaming to intervene. But Elvis's command was unmistakable. "Stand down." The heckler gaped upward at him, disbelief mingling with defiance. His chest rose and fell heavily, and for the first time his bravado faltered. He had screamed from the safety of the crowd, but now the king had summoned him into the light. "No games," Elvis said, softer now, but the microphone carried the intimacy to the farthest balcony. "Come. If you've got something, say it here." The tension snapped through the audience like electricity. Thousands of hearts pounded, each person torn between dread and fascination. The story unfolding before them was no longer a concert. They were witnessing something raw, unscripted, unpredictable. The man's hands clenched at his sides. His legs shook with the effort of hauling himself higher. Two ushers made a hesitant move forward, but Elvis lifted a finger. No further. The stranger dragged himself upright, swaying unsteadily at the foot of the stage. He looked up at Elvis, with eyes that no longer blazed only with fury, but with something more complex. Pain, longing, resentment, too old to put into clean words. The crowd erupted in conflict. Some booed, others screamed encouragement, others simply sat wide-eyed. The room was a storm of divided voices, but at its center, Elvis and the heckler stood locked in a private exchange. For Elvis, time seemed to dilate. He saw not a drunk, not a threat, but a man weighed down by invisible battles. He held himself steady, refusing to let fear or anger dictate his response. The orchestra remained still, instruments raised but untouched. Even they seemed spellbound, waiting for the next move. The stranger leaned forward, gripping the edge of the stage. His voice trembled, but carried the edge of a blade. "You've turned your back on us, on the ones who believed in you before all this gold and glitter." The words cut through the hall like broken glass. Elvis didn't answer. He simply waited. And in that waiting, in the deliberate, unflinching silence, he wielded more power than any retort could muster. The crowd held still, caught between fear and awe. The invitation had been extended. The stage was no longer just a stage. It had become a battlefield of truth. And with the next step, the man would either rise into it or be consumed by it. The man finally hauled himself onto the stage. The audience gasped as if a wild animal had been unleashed among them. His shoes scuffed against the polished floorboards, his frame unsteady, yet driven by a force stronger than the liquor in his veins. He stood just a few feet from Elvis, blinking into the blaze of the spotlights that washed out every flaw and line on his face. Up close, he was no longer just a heckler lost in the crowd. He was a man hollowed out by grief. His jacket sagged on his shoulders, creased and stained, his shirt clinging damp to his chest. The glass he had clutched earlier was gone, left somewhere in the scramble forward, but the reek of whiskey clung to him. His hands shook, as though fighting ghosts only he could see. The guards bristled on either side of the stage, waiting for Elvis to nod. The crowd hissed and booed, some demanding action, others craning their necks, unwilling to look away from the unfolding drama. 20,000 souls strained forward, breathless, their night of entertainment having shifted into something rawer, stranger, more dangerous. The intruder's voice cracked the silence. "You think you're above us now?" The words weren't shouted like before. They came ragged, almost pleading, as though dragged out of the marrow of his bones. He stared at Elvis with a mixture of rage and despair, eyes searching for something he himself didn't understand. Elvis didn't recoil. He took a half-step forward, enough to make the space between them vanish into intimacy. His microphone caught his response, quiet but steady. "I never thought I was better than anyone. Never." The hall hushed again, every ear straining. The softness of Elvis's tone demanded attention, in a way anger never could. The man shook his head violently, his fists clenched. "Then why stand there, covered in jewels, while the rest of us are drowning? You forgot the dirt. You forgot what it's like to fight for scraps. You forgot who you are." His voice broke at the last word, cracking like a whip across the crowd. People murmured in shock. Some whispered for security, to drag him off before the night spun fully out of control. But Elvis stayed rooted. His eyes never wavered. He didn't look at the man as an intruder. He looked at him as though he'd been expected. "I haven't forgotten," Elvis said slowly. His voice was calm, but each word landed heavy. "I still remember that boy with nothing in his pockets. I remember my mama crying when the rent was due. I remember the army. I remember being far from home, wondering if I'd ever get back." The crowd listened as if in church. The man's chest heaved, his lips parted, but no sound came. His face crumpled under the weight of Elvis's words. "You're lying," he burst out suddenly, though his tone carried less venom now, more desperation. "You don't know loss. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." And then the dam broke. His voice cracked, nearly a scream. "I served. I buried my brothers. I came home to nothing. No family, no work, no hope. And here you are, shining for them, while we rot in the dark." The confession rang across the stage like confession at the gallows. The audience gasped. Some clutched at their hearts, others bowed their heads, as if ashamed to have witnessed such naked pain. The hall was utterly still. Elvis drew a breath, long and heavy. He lowered the microphone a little, his eyes locked on the man, seeing not a drunk, not an enemy, but a wound left open to fester. "What's your name?" Elvis asked softly. The man blinked, startled by the question. He stammered, but no words came. His throat worked, his jaw clenched. It was as though no one had asked him his name in years, as though he had been invisible until this moment. Elvis didn't press. He only held his gaze. "I know pain," he continued quietly. "I know what it's like to feel like the world forgot you. But you're not forgotten. Not here. Not tonight." The stranger staggered back half a step, overcome, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked as if he might crumble right there on the stage. The audience was stunned. Many had expected a scuffle, a removal, perhaps even a scene of violence. But what unfolded instead was something deeper, an unexpected dialogue, a collision of two lives under the crushing light of the stage. The man swallowed hard, his eyes glistening under the harsh lights. For the first time, he seemed less like a threat and more like a man fighting to be heard. And 20,000 people leaned in, waiting for what Elvis would do next. The man stood trembling in the spotlight, his chest heaving, his words still echoing in the silence. "I lost everything." The room, packed with 20,000 strangers, seemed to lean forward as one body, straining to witness what would happen next. Even the air felt thick, like it might shatter if anyone dared to breathe too loudly. Elvis moved first. Slowly, with the kind of poise that made the entire stage feel like his alone, he stepped closer until only a few feet separated him from the broken figure. His hand rose, not in defense, not in command, but in quiet recognition. He placed it gently on the man's shoulder. Gasps rippled through the audience. For them, it was unthinkable. To touch a heckler, to lower the barrier between star and stranger, that was not how legends behaved. Security tensed at the edges of the stage, eyes locked, waiting for an attack, but Elvis's calm presence held them frozen in place. The man's body stiffened under the contact. His fists, clenched tight moments earlier, trembled and then faltered. His eyes darted upward to meet Elvis's. What he found there was not fury, nor mockery, but something deeper. Recognition. Elvis lifted the microphone, his voice carrying softly, the weight of it amplified in the hush. "I wore the uniform, too," he said. "I slept in the mud, missed home, buried friends younger than me. Don't think I don't know loss. Don't think I don't know sacrifice." The words rolled through the hall like a prayer, They were not shouted, yet they struck harder than any rebuke could. In the balcony, a veteran in dress blues straightened his back. A woman near the front row covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Scattered applause began, hesitant, respectful, like raindrops tapping the roof before a storm. The man's lip quivered. His anger seemed to falter under the weight of Elvis's admission. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a strangled sound that betrayed how long he had carried his grief unseen. Elvis didn't let go of his shoulder. He leaned closer. His voice meant not only for the man, but for everyone listening. "I never thought I was above anyone. I just found one thing I could do: sing, and I've given my life to it, not because it makes me rich, but because sometimes music is the only thing that keeps a man alive." The orchestra behind him sat in stunned silence, instruments resting on laps, bowstrings slack, horns lowered. The musicians were as transfixed as the audience. The air vibrated not with music now, but with something more powerful: shared humanity. A single pair of hands began to clap in the darkness. Then another. Soon the sound swelled, rolling across the room in uneven bursts until it became a wave of applause. It wasn't the roaring cheer of a Vegas crowd demanding another hit. It was slower, rawer, born out of something deeper than entertainment. The man swayed, his breathing ragged, his eyes wet. For the first time that night, he seemed unsure of himself, unmoored by compassion where he had expected rejection. His voice cracked as he tried again. "They don't hear us. Nobody hears us." Elvis drew him in closer, so the microphone carried both their voices. "I hear you," Elvis said firmly. "I hear every word, and tonight, so does everyone else in this room." The man's composure finally broke. His body shuddered, his face crumpled, and tears spilled down his cheeks. The audience, once bracing for violence, now sat in stunned disbelief as the intruder, who had begun as a heckler, an enemy, crumbled into sobs on the stage. Elvis wrapped an arm around him, pulling him into an embrace. The sight froze time. The lights glared down on sequined white fabric pressed against a rumpled jacket, the king of rock and roll holding a stranger like a brother. The silence inside the hall was so profound that even the man's muffled sobs were audible through the microphone. For once, Vegas, city of endless noise, was utterly still. Then, gradually, the crowd rose to its feet. Not in frenzy, not in spectacle, but in reverence. 20,000 people stood, their applause no longer applause, but a recognition of something sacred unfolding before them. Elvis did not bask in it. He simply held the man tighter, whispering words no microphone caught. His face softened, his eyes glistening with something unguarded, something only those closest to the stage could see. The legend and the lost soul stood as one, and in that embrace, the hall transformed. It was no longer a concert. It was confession, redemption, and proof that even under the glare of Las Vegas lights, humanity could still cut through the glitter. And as the applause grew, building into a rolling surge, one truth settled over the room. This was not a night anyone would forget. The embrace lingered longer than anyone expected. For a few moments, the concert hall was transformed into something unrecognizable. Neither theater nor casino, but a sanctuary. The sight of Elvis holding the man, not pushing him away, not humiliating him, silenced even the most hardened gamblers in the back rows. The orchestra had dropped their instruments into their laps. One violinist stared at the floor, tears sliding freely down her cheeks. A trumpeter, a veteran himself, blinked rapidly, lips trembling as he held his horn uselessly. No cue had been given, yet no one dared play a note. Elvis finally loosened his hold. though his hand still rested firmly on the man's shoulder. He raised his head, turning his eyes outward, sweeping across the vast expanse of the audience. When he spoke into the microphone, his voice was low, steady, and it carried with the weight of a confession. "You think this show is for the rich?" His tone wasn't angry. It was earnest, measured. "Look around you. Look at who's here tonight." His arm gestured out toward the crowd. Thousands of faces turned instinctively to scan their neighbors. They saw sequined gowns next to wrinkled suits, soldiers seated beside tourists in shirt sleeves, businessmen rubbing elbows with factory workers. The hall was not one class, not one story. It was all of them. "Do you see it?" Elvis's voice rose slightly, but never broke. "We all breathe the same air in this room. We all feel the same hurt. We all carry our scars. The costumes, the lights, they don't matter. They never mattered. I stand here because music saved me when nothing else could." The man beside him shook, his eyes still wet. Elvis squeezed his shoulder, grounding him, but the words were meant for everyone. A murmur swelled in the hall, soft cries, shuffling feet, a cough that sounded like a sob. Then, slowly, people began rising to their feet. First in the balcony, then near the stage, then all the way back where the waiters had frozen mid-service. They stood not in a rush of excitement, but in solemn unity, as if the act of rising itself was a prayer. Applause began again, but this time it wasn't wild or celebratory. It came steady, deliberate, each clap carrying a weight of recognition. Some men pounded their chests with fists, unable to speak. Women dabbed their eyes with cocktail napkins. The sound filled the cavernous space until it was overwhelming. Less like an ovation, more like a tidal wave of shared humanity. The man on stage looked out at the sight. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but he couldn't summon words. His whole frame sagged as though the burden he had carried for years had suddenly been made visible to the world, no longer his alone. Elvis tilted the microphone back to his lips, his gaze soft but unyielding. "I'm not here to be worshipped," he said. "I'm not here for the money. I'm here because music can do what nothing else can. It can hold us together, even when the world tries to tear us apart." The words echoed into the rafters, and the hall responded not with more noise, but with stillness. The applause quieted gradually until all that remained was silence again. Only now it was different. This wasn't the silence of tension or fear or accusation. It was reverence. 20,000 people breathing together, not a glass clinking, not a whisper carrying. It was a silence that felt alive, vibrating, as if the entire hall had become a single heart beating in unison. Elvis closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaled deeply, then exhaled. He seemed lighter, as though the exchange had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders, too. When he opened them, he turned once more to the man, speaking quietly enough that the microphone nearly missed it. "They're listening now, and so am I." The man dropped his head into his hands, overcome, and Elvis stood beside him, steady and unshaken. The silence lingered, pressing deeper into the soul of everyone present, until it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this room, this night, this impossible moment. It was silence everyone could hear, and no one would ever forget. The silence lingered, heavy as velvet, until Elvis slowly reached for the stand beside him. From it he plucked a white scarf, damp with the sweat of performance, a token he often tossed into the crowd as a souvenir. But this time there was no flourish, no playful gesture. His movement was deliberate, solemn, almost ritualistic. The man beside him, shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed red, barely noticed until Elvis pressed the fabric into his trembling hands. The scarf sagged between them, bridging two lives that had collided in the unlikeliest of places. "Keep this," Elvis said, his voice low, steady, caught by the microphone so that every soul in the hall heard it. "Let it remind you that even when the world takes everything, you're still here. And as long as you're here, there's still something left worth holding." The man stared at the cloth as though it were something unearthly. His fingers clenched around it, knuckles pale, his breath coming fast and uneven. Then, to the astonishment of the crowd, his knees buckled. He sank onto the stage floor, sobbing openly, clutching the scarf to his chest. The hall erupted, not in chaos, but in thunderous applause, waves of sound rising like surf against a cliff. People stood, clapping until their palms burned, tears running freely down their cheeks. Some shouted words of encouragement. Others simply cried. They weren't witnessing spectacle anymore. They were watching redemption. And then Elvis did something no one expected. He turned away from the man and walked slowly toward the grand piano, positioned at the side of the stage. His cape trailed behind him, catching the light in ripples of white and gold. The band looked at one another, confused. There was no cue, no set-list instruction. Elvis sat down heavily on the bench. For a moment he simply rested his hands on the keys, head bowed, the stage lights glinting on his dark hair. Then he began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. "You'll never walk alone." Gasps rippled through the audience. The song hadn't been part of the evening's program. It hadn't been rehearsed with the orchestra. Yet, within seconds, the hall was filled with the tender, rolling chords of a hymn that carried more weight than any hit single could. Elvis's voice entered gently, resonant with sincerity. "When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high." The words hung in the air, raw, unguarded. This wasn't Vegas showmanship. This was prayer. His baritone wrapped around the crowd like a benediction, pulling them into the moment with irresistible force. One by one, audience members began to join in. Softly at first, hesitant whispers of melody, untrained voices trying to follow. Then, stronger. Soldiers in uniform sang through clenched jaws. Women in evening gowns pressed hands to their hearts as they lifted their voices. Men who had come only to gamble found themselves mouthing the words through tears. Even the heckler, still kneeling on the stage floor with the scarf in his grip, raised his head and croaked out the lines, broken but audible. His voice cracked, his throat raw, but he sang as though it were the first true sound he had made in years. The hall transformed. It was no longer a performance, but a congregation, 20,000 voices swelling into a single hymn. The chandeliers trembled with the sound. The velvet curtains absorbed the vibrations of hope and sorrow blended together. Waiters, frozen in the aisles with trays half raised, sang too. Elvis's fingers moved firmly across the keys, his voice growing stronger with every verse, tears glinting at the corners of his eyes. He was no longer singing to them, he was singing with them, dissolving the barrier between star and crowd. By the final refrain, the entire room thundered with the words, "You'll never walk alone." The sound shook the rafters. People clutched strangers beside them, hands grasped across tables, heads pressed together. For those minutes, there were no gamblers, no tourists, no businessmen, no soldiers, only people bound by a song that promised they weren't alone in their grief, in their joy, in their lives. When the last note faded, Elvis let his hands rest on the keys, his chest heaving, his gaze lowered. He didn't move immediately. The audience stood transfixed, unwilling to break the spell. The man on the stage was still kneeling, but now his sobs had quieted into something else, a stunned stillness, as though the music had stitched something closed inside him. The scarf was still in his hands, but his grip had softened, as though he no longer needed to cling to it to survive. Then came the eruption. The ovation rose like a storm, crashing in wave after wave, people stomping their feet, clapping until their arms ached. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was gratitude for something far greater. And Elvis, still seated at the piano, let it wash over him, his head bowed, not as a king receiving worship, but as a man humbled by the power of what had just passed between him and 20,000 others. The gift had been given, and it had changed everyone in the room. The final chord of You'll Never Walk Alone lingered in the rafters, trembling like smoke that refused to fade. For several seconds, the piano stood silent, Elvis's hands resting on the keys, his head lowered. The crowd dared not move. It felt as if the room itself were holding its breath, unwilling to disturb what had just been created. Then Elvis lifted his gaze, eyes glistening under the spotlights. He rose slowly from the bench, the cape spilling behind him as he walked back toward the center of the stage. The man, still kneeling, looked up at him with a mixture of awe and exhaustion, the scarf clutched against his chest as though it were a lifeline. Elvis extended a hand. The hall gasped again, though softer this time, less in shock than in reverence. The man blinked, hesitant, then reached up. Elvis pulled him gently to his feet. The stranger swayed, unsteady, but Elvis steadied him, guiding him upright like a brother lifting another from the battlefield. Together, they stood before the audience. "I know," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice stronger now, carrying across the silent sea of faces. "We stumble, we break, we do things we regret. But that doesn't make us less human. It doesn't mean we're finished." He paused, scanning the audience. His tone shifted, as though the words weren't just for the man beside him, but for everyone watching. Every one of us here has a chance to stand back up, even tonight, even now. The statement hung in the air like scripture. Heads nodded. A woman in the balcony pressed her hands together in prayer. A soldier near the front row straightened his posture, tears streaking his cheeks. Even the dealers and waiters clustered at the back stood transfixed, their trays forgotten, as though they too had been addressed personally. Elvis turned slightly to the man and, with the quiet authority only he could command, placed him into the hands of the security guards waiting discreetly at the stage edge. But there was no hostility in the gesture, no punishment. He handed him over as one would a guest, not a trespasser. The man was led gently away, still clutching the scarf, his head bowed, but his steps steady. The ovation came again, surging like thunder. People leapt to their feet, clapping, stomping, shouting, their voices breaking with emotion. The energy of it shook the room, no longer the roar of gamblers demanding spectacle, but the release of 20,000 souls who had witnessed a miracle of humanity in a place built on glitter and chance. Elvis stood at the center, receiving it not with arrogance, but with humility. He bowed his head, eyes closing for a moment, letting the noise crash over him like waves on a shore. Then he raised the microphone again, speaking not loudly, but with a quiet power that carried to the farthest rows. "Let's keep singing. Together." The crowd roared anew, not because of the words alone, but because they understood what he meant. The show would go on, not as it had before, but as something transformed. The band, still shaken, glanced at one another. Slowly, The conductor lifted his baton. The first bright notes of the next song filled the air, tentative at first, then stronger, as though the musicians themselves had been reborn by what they had seen. Elvis launched into the rhythm, his voice surging once again, but something in it had changed. It wasn't the polished showman's tone. It was rawer, more direct, as if every lyric carried the memory of the man who had stood on that stage moments earlier. Each word landed with gravity. Each note carried deeper weight. The audience, though exhausted from the storm of emotions, gave everything back. They clapped in rhythm, shouted encouragement, some dancing where they stood. Yet, through it all, the undercurrent of reverence remained. Everyone knew they were witnessing a night unlike any other. By the time the final number ended, the applause seemed endless. People shouted his name, waved programs, stretched their arms forward as if trying to hold on to him a little longer. Elvis took it in quietly, offering a bow, the glint of sweat on his brow catching the light. He looked less like a king basking in glory, and more like a man who had given everything he had, and been changed himself in the process. As the curtain finally descended, the sound of the ovation still roared through the hall, echoing even as the lights dimmed. For those who had been there, it was never just another concert in Las Vegas. It became a memory etched into their lives, the night when anger gave way to compassion, when music rose higher than spectacle, when the king showed not his crown, but his heart. And for Elvis himself, it was a reminder that no matter how bright the lights, how heavy the costume, or how wide the gulf between him and the world, the bridge of a song could close the distance. That night, in a hall filled with smoke, sweat, perfume, and tears, 20,000 people walked out carrying the same truth. They had seen a man stop chaos with kindness, turn pain into prayer, and remind them all that no one, no matter how broken, is ever truly alone. It was the finale no one forgot.